stronger receptive language. Articulation issues, and this again, huge variation. Some of the students I've worked with are almost impossible to understand their articulation if you're not really familiar with them. Other students, their articulation is fine. And that makes a huge difference in independence if a child has articulation issues. And that's where's our one speech therapist? No, we don't have a speech therapist, okay. So that's where you get into looking at augmentative communication systems. A young woman that I've worked with for years, great difficulty with oral communication, has been absolutely resistant to augmentative communication. I mean, they have just tried everything with her, and she wants to speak. That's her preferred method of communication. You know, and at 18, her articulation is not going to get better, most likely. So it's good, really, where we have to look at, it's her preference if she doesn't want to use augmentative communication. I think the thought is we keep hoping that she'll decide that that would be a good thing for her to do. Any of you work with a child with Down syndrome who uses supportive, so what kind of augmentative?
We use an iPad.
An iPad? Yeah, iPads have certainly changed the whole picture of augmentative communication because it's just so much easier with the apps that are available, pro loquo, just so many things that are available that used to cost a huge amount of money. But again, that's a great example where the team really has to work together to put that into place. Strong visual spatial processing and memory, but definitely auditory processing is much slower. All right? So when I say visual spatial processing, what do you think of? What comes to mind?
Picture supports.
Pardon?
You mean picture supports, like visual supports?
Okay, so pictures could support it, but if you're interacting with a child with Down syndrome and we're thinking that they have strong visual spatial processing,
they're able to interact with their environment well visually.
visually, yeah. So yes, visual supports, but just they're able to sort of look at what's around them, figure that out, take all that in, as opposed to auditory processing, all right? So when you have a student in class and there's somebody talking at the front of the room and they're just talking with not any visuals, that's really hard. That's very, very hard for an individual with Down syndrome. And if they have a hearing loss, that's going to exacerbate the problem, all right? So auditory processing, I was just looking for it. Oh, I guess. So I guess we'll talk about that later. But the auditory processing, you definitely need to make sure that you give the student some time to process. You know, we tend to be, in schools, we're in a hurry. We're always pressed for time, you know, go, go, go. And the child with Down syndrome really needs you to give them some time to process what you've asked of them. They may need some other supports, but they definitely need time. Short-term and working memory, I think this can be a real frustration for people working with students with Down syndrome. You teach them something one day and you come back the next day and they don't necessarily remember it. You're nodding your head. Have you had that experience?
Yeah, when I was back in the school system for a little bit, but it's just repetition and going back over things. But
Right, the repetition and going back. What about working memory? What does that refer to? Anybody have an idea of what working memory is? Okay, so part of it is the retrieving it. It's also being able to hold things in your head while you're doing a task. So you're retrieving that memory. You're having to tie your shoe if it's a motor task, or you're trying to do an academic task, and you have to hold those things in your head. And that's really a big problem for students with Down syndrome. They may have the information, they have to retrieve it, and then they have to be able to work with it.